It is there for the first time in the Bible that we are introduced to this man by the name of Belshazzar. He was Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, and he ruled as the king of Babylon after Nebuchadnezzar. And Daniel tells us about him. In verse 1, he says that Belshazzar, the king, made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in the presence of the thousands. Now, this was hardly a time to throw a drinking party. The city is actually under siege by the Medes and the Persians at this very moment in Daniel chapter 5. There are armies gathered around the city of Babylon, but apparently trusting in the thickness and the height of these massive walls that surrounded Babylon, and maybe seeking to calm down the community of people that lived there and his co-rulers and so on, he throws this massive drinking party that goes on for days. And something happens while they're all getting drunk. Belshazzar sees a human hand appear out of nowhere and write a mysterious message on the wall that no one was able to interpret. Well, Daniel was called in to help interpret the message. You'll see down in verse 13. I'm not going to read through the whole chapter here. But the message was given by Daniel that Belshazzar's kingdom was done in verse 26. God had just about enough of this wicked king. And so God says, you know what? You're done. We're putting an end to this whole thing with you. Well, the Bible goes on to tell us in this same chapter, in verse 30, that very night Belshazzar was killed, and the city of Babylon passed into the hands of the Medes and the Persians. An ancient Greek historian by the name of Herodotus, born about 484 BC, he tells us how the city was overthrown. He tells us in his account of this that the Persians gained entry into Babylon by diverting the Euphrates River that flowed into the city and coming underneath the city up under the walls through its riverbed. Well, this passage of Scripture, Daniel chapter 5, was long the target of critics' cannons. They considered Daniel's reference to a king by the name of Belshazzar here to be pure invention and a historical blunder. Why is that? Well, because the name Belshazzar could not be found anywhere outside of the Bible, and the ancient historians Berosus and Alexander Polyhistor said that the last king of the Babylonian Empire was a man named not Belshazzar, but Nabonidus. Nabonidus. And so critics of the Bible insisted for years, decades, that the author of the book of Daniel just made up the name Belshazzar. And a lot of critics of the Bible applauded that kind of thinking. They agreed with that. And Christians had to endure the scorn over this passage. Daniel says his name was Belshazzar. We've got two other historians who say it was actually Nabonidus. 2-1, we win, you're the fool for believing these myths, you know. That's what they said. Until this tablet was found by archaeologists. This Babylonian tablet, there on the screen, tells us that when King Nabonidus left Babylon for a multi-year stay in the Arabian oasis town of Tema, about 450 miles away, he entrusted the rule of the Babylonian Empire into the hands of Belshazzar, his eldest son. Belshazzar, what do you know? The Bible was right. Sometimes it just takes historians and archaeologists thousands of years to catch up with the Bible. You know, after Babylon fell, the Jews who had been taken captive there and held for 70 years in Babylonian captivity were finally allowed to return home, which leads us to another exciting discovery having to do with the end of the Babylonian exile. The book of Ezra tells us that Cyrus the Great, the king of Persia, the one who conquered Babylon, gave the Jewish people permission to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. Now, some critics of the Bible thought that this was just fictional storytelling in the Bible until an archaeologist unearthed this 2,600-year-old clay cylinder in the ruins at Babylon. It's called the Cyrus cylinder, and the ancient Akkadian cuneiform script on it corroborates the Bible's details in Ezra chapter 1, stating very clearly that Cyrus allowed the captives to return home. The Cyrus cylinder is housed today at the British Museum in London for all to see. All right, let's talk about one more discovery that touches on the reliability of the Old Testament. I'm sure you've heard of them before, the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls. In 1947, a shepherd boy tending his father's sheep in Qumran, north and to the west of the Dead Sea in Israel, made an amazing discovery while looking for a lost goat. There in Qumran, in a hillside cave that had laid untouched for nearly 2,000 years, this 12-year-old boy discovered a collection of large clay jars containing carefully wrapped leather manuscripts. What this boy stumbled upon was an ancient collection of handwritten copies of the Old Testament that dated as far back as the 3rd century before Christ. This was an astounding discovery. Archaeologists were called in. They spent years searching the surrounding caves. By the time they were done, copies of every book of the Old Testament had been found, with the exception of Esther. In some cases, there were multiple copies of the same book. For example, they found 19 copies of the book of Isaiah, 25 copies of Deuteronomy, and 30 copies of the Psalms, 220 biblical scrolls in totality. Amazing. What you're seeing right now on the screen is a photograph of one of the original clay jars and a close-up of one of the scrolls of Isaiah. This particular scroll of Isaiah has been dated to at least 100 years before Jesus' birth. They opened it up upon its discovery. It was 26 feet long, not one chapter missing, when compared to a modern-day translation of the book of Isaiah. It's all been digitally photographed. It's available free online. If you know Hebrew, you can look through the ancient prophecies made regarding Jesus. Isaiah 53, for example, where we are told that the coming Messiah would be crushed for our iniquities, that we're healed by his stripes. His death would bring about reconciliation for sinners with God. Amazing discovery. Now, why do I mention the Dead Sea Scrolls? Well, because the Dead Sea Scrolls and thousands of other manuscripts dating back to the time of the early church have allowed biblical scholars, translators, and textual experts to recover with a very high degree of certainty the text of the Bible that Jesus quoted and that the early Christians used 2,000 years ago. It gives us confidence that we have accurate copies of the Bible today. Let's switch gears now and talk about some archaeological discoveries that bear witness to the reliability of the New Testament. The New Testament. One of the first people we're introduced to when you get into the New Testament is this individual, King Herod. King Herod. The Bible tells us that Herod was the king in Israel at the time of Jesus' birth, and that he tried to have Jesus killed shortly after he was born. Was he just a legendary villain, perhaps? Just a guy someone made up? No. In addition to the fact that the first century historian Flavius Josephus wrote about him, a wealth of archaeological evidence has now confirmed his existence. Discoveries include this piece of a wine jug dating back to 19 BC that was uncovered at Masada, Herod's cliffside palace fortress overlooking the Dead Sea. The inscription on the jug includes a reference to Herod and his full title, Herod, King of Judea. Other discoveries include coins with Herod's name on them, Herod's desert palace south of Jericho, and his hilltop palace south of Jerusalem known as the Herodium. These discoveries all support the New Testament accounts and leave no doubt that Herod was a real historical figure and that he reigned in the very position described in the Gospels, King of Judea. How about John the Baptist? Let's talk about him for a couple of minutes. The New Testament tells us that Herod the Great's son, Herod Antipas, cast John the Baptist into prison for condemning Antipas's adulterous relationship with his brother's wife. Well, sometime later, an executioner came and John was beheaded. You're familiar with that. Well, this too has been confirmed outside of the Bible. Flavius Josephus writes about Herod Antipas and his adulterous wife and the murder of John the Baptist in his book, Antiquities of the Jews. Here's a short excerpt. Notice who he mentions there in the top line. Josephus says, John, that was called the Baptist, was a good man and commanded the Jews to exercise virtue, both as to righteousness towards one another and piety towards God, and so to come to baptism. Herod, who feared the great influence John had over the people, sent him a prisoner out of Herod's suspicious temper to Machaerus, the castle I before mentioned, and was there put to death. So notice that Josephus, a first century historian, he verifies for us that John the Baptist was a real person in Israel in the first century with an enormous influence over the people before he was murdered by Herod Antipas, just as the Bible said. Well, archaeologists have discovered now the very palace where John was killed. Josephus tells us here in this quote that the palace was called Machaerus. Archaeologists have found it and unearthed it on top of this hill overlooking the Dead Sea. Excavations there are ongoing, but in the meantime, archaeologists have created this cutaway rendering of what the palace would have looked like in the first century. Walking around the ruins today, as you're allowed to do, you can see the remains of its massive walls, columns, mosaic floors. There's an elaborate bath, an aqueduct, water cisterns, the very place John the Baptist spent his final day. All right, moving along, let's talk for a couple of minutes about this man, Caiaphas. The New Testament tells us that the name of the Jewish high priest at the time of Jesus was Caiaphas. He was the one who presided over that late night trial wherein Jesus confessed himself to be the Messiah, which of course resulted in his condemnation. It was also in the courtyard of Caiaphas' house that Peter denied knowing who Jesus was. Well, there was an exciting discovery. In 1990, a team of construction workers building a water park approximately 2 miles south of Jerusalem accidentally unearthed a first-century Jewish burial cave. Because of its enormous weight, the bulldozer crashed through the roof of the cave. They didn't even know there was a cave underneath. The bulldozer discovered it because of its weight. It crushed it. Well, archaeologists inside the cave, they found several bone ossuaries, stone boxes that the Jews used in the first 2 centuries to collect the bones of the deceased. Well, on one of the uncharacteristically ornate ossuaries was an inscription in Aramaic mentioning Caiaphas' full name, first and last, Joseph Caiaphas, the very name reported by Flavius Josephus. This ossuary is on display today in the museum in Jerusalem, bearing testimony to the fact Caiaphas was a real person. And it's amazing when you visit the Israeli museum, you can go right up to it. They don't even have it behind glass. It's just right there. You can get your face like an inch away from it and examine it. It's just amazing to behold some of this stuff right there in front of you on display. Let's talk about this man for a couple of minutes, Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate, what has archaeology shown about his life? Well, let's dive into it. According to the New Testament, he was the governor, the Roman governor, who oversaw Jesus' trial and then sentenced him to death by crucifixion. Was he a legendary villain? No. In 1961, archaeologists were digging in Caesarea on the shore of the beautiful Mediterranean Sea there in Israel. While clearing away the sand and overgrowth from the jumbled ruins of this ancient Roman theater, these archaeologists made an incredible discovery. They found this limestone block about 3 feet tall with an inscription in Latin dating to the early part of the 1st century mentioning Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. This inscription verified for us that Pontius Pilate was a real person, that he reigned in the very position ascribed to him in the Gospels, and as a prefect or governor, he truly would have had the authority to pardon or condemn Jesus, just as the Gospel accounts report. So there's good evidence for Herod, Caiaphas, Pontius Pilate, John the Baptist. What about this person? Jesus. Well, there's plenty of written evidence for Jesus' life. In addition to the 27 documents in the New Testament that tell us about his life and ministry, more than 30 non-biblical sources mention Jesus within 150 years of his life, including Roman historians like Suetonius and Tacitus, as well as Flavius Josephus and the Jewish Talmud. So the literary evidence is very strong for Jesus' life. But what about stones or coins or inscriptions mentioning Jesus? Have archaeologists found anything mentioning Jesus along those lines? Well, the answer is yes. On November 5th, 2005, Israeli archaeologists announced an amazing discovery. In Megiddo, in northern Israel, a prison inmate at a maximum security prison unearthed the remains of one of the oldest Christian churches ever discovered. They've dated it back to the 2nd or 3rd century AD. You never know what a prisoner might find if you just give him some free time. In the prison yard and a shovel. I mean, there's stuff all over the place there in Israel. I think they need to pass out more shovels. While digging around in the prison yard, Ramil Razillo, that was the guy's name, discovered a 16 by 32-foot Greek-style mosaic floor that bore an inscription mentioning that the building had been built in the memory of the God, Jesus Christ. This is the first uncontested archaeological discovery mentioning Jesus by name, and it was found in our lifetime, back in 2005. Not only does this discovery help reinforce the fact that Jesus existed, it underscores what we have long known. The earliest Christians believed Jesus was God. Right there on the floor of that little church, they said, this building is dedicated to the God, Jesus Christ, not the good teacher, Jesus, or the prophet Jesus, or the angel Jesus. No, this building is dedicated to the God, Jesus Christ. Tell your Jehovah's Witness friend about that one. They'll insist that Jesus wasn't God. The early Christians never believed that. Jesus was actually Michael the Archangel, they say, incarnate. No, the Bible clearly denies that, but now we also have archaeology backing us up on this as well. But what about the town of Bethlehem? This is fun to mention going into the Christmas season. You Bible students know that Micah, the Hebrew prophet by the name of Micah, prophesied around 700 BC that the coming Messiah would be born in the town of Bethlehem. Well, for years, critics of the Bible doubted that Bethlehem even existed back in Old Testament times. No archaeology or no archaeological evidence had been found for it. Well, that changed in 2012. Israeli archaeologists excavating in Jerusalem found this tiny clay seal dating back to the 8th century BC. It was inscribed with these ancient Hebrew words, "From the town of Bethlehem to the king," end quote. That means someone literally sent something, probably a tax payment, from Bethlehem to the royal government in Jerusalem. It's the very first proof outside of the Bible that Bethlehem existed during the Old Testament era. An amazing find, and once again, confirming the historical accuracy of Scripture. What about first century crucifixion? First century crucifixion, as you know, the Bible, of course, tells us that Jesus' hands or wrists were nailed to the cross. But you know, at one time, critics of the Bible said crucifixions with nails never even took place in Israel in the first century. There's no evidence they happened, and nails wouldn't hold up the weight of the bodies, the critics said. Well, they were shown to be wrong again when a crew of builders accidentally discovered an ancient Jewish cemetery in Jerusalem. It contained the remains of several men killed during the Jewish revolt against Rome in approximately AD 70. One of the bone ossuaries, this one there on the screen, contained the skeleton of a young man and an inscription of the man's name. But what stunned archaeologists most was how this man died. He was put to death by crucifixion with nails. How was that determined? Well, he still had an iron spike driven through his heel bone. On the screen, you're seeing the actual heel bone with the original spike. You'll notice the head of the spike on the left and the bent tip on the right. It's on display today in the museum in Jerusalem. The Romans typically removed the nails from their victims, and for good reason. Iron was expensive, but apparently this nail was too difficult to remove. The tip of the nail had been bent back toward the head, likely the result of hitting a knot in the wood. And so the Roman soldiers left it there. And I'm so glad they did. Because 2,000 years later now, we have solid archaeological evidence that the Romans did crucify people in Israel in the first century with nails, just like the Bible says it. All right, let's head down the home stretch here and wrap it up by talking for a few minutes about people and places mentioned by Luke. People and places mentioned by Luke. In the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, Luke tells us about the spread of Christianity from Jerusalem to Rome. In his detailed accounts, he mentions 32 countries, 54 cities, 9 different islands, ports, the names and titles of priests and political leaders, deities that certain cities worship, weather patterns, shipping lanes, laws, customs, very detailed. If you've read the Gospel of Luke or the book of Acts, you know, Luke paid attention to tiny details, and he sprinkles those into his writings. And I appreciate that, his writing style. It makes his writings a little more testable. With all these details, we can weigh them against what history has shown and determine whether Luke was an accurate historian or not. Well, some critics of the Bible thought Luke was just making up all of this kind of stuff in the book of Acts. Hans Conzelmann, a European scholar and the author of a book I do not recommend, History of Primitive Christianity, he declared the book of Acts to be a made-up story beginning to end. Critics like Conzelmann believed that Luke had concocted his narrative from the rambling of his imagination, one guy said, because he ascribes odd titles to authorities. He mentions governors that no one knew. One example of a supposed error can be found in Luke chapter 3. verse 1. Luke tells us there that John the Baptist's preaching ministry was taking place when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea and a man by the name of Lysanias was tetrarch of Abilene. Now, you've probably read over that verse a dozen or more times in your journeys through the Bible and never realized that this was the target. This verse was the target for decades by the critics. This verse. They thought it disproved Luke's accuracy. For years, scholars pointed to that verse as evidence that Luke did not know what he was talking about, since all of the scholars knew that Lysanias was not a tetrarch, but rather the ruler of a different region by the name of Chalcis, hundreds of miles away, half a century earlier. And so they said, if Luke can't get that basic fact right, nothing he's written can be trusted. And a host of Bible critics accuse Luke of a gross chronological blunder, among other things. Well, John McRae, a veteran archaeologist who's overseen excavations in Israel, explains how archaeology vindicated Luke when it came to this verse in Luke chapter 3, verse 1. John McRae said this, I'll put a quote on the screen. He said, an inscription was later found from the time of Tiberius, from AD 14 to 37, which names Lysanias as tetrarch in Abilah near Damascus, just as Luke had written. It turned out there had been two government officials named Lysanias. Once more, Luke was shown to be exactly right, end quote. So it turns out that it was the critics who made the gross chronological blunder, not Luke. And this is just one example of how archaeology has proved Luke to be right. To date, more than 80 details in the book of Acts alone have been confirmed by historical and archaeological research. Amazing. Now, I've mentioned several discoveries this morning. I mean, there's literally thousands of these. I've got books on archaeology in my library that are 600 pages thick, just on Old Testament discoveries. So that was a bit of a flyover this morning of some of the discoveries that I thought might be of interest to you.